Amendment number 5. Let's finish this out. So, anyways, your Fifth Amendment, kind of hard to explain because unlike the previous ones, this is the other one that has multiple parts, and some of the parts are related and some aren't. We call the Fifth Amendment the rights of the accused because now that we've searched someone, we are going to talk about pretty much what the rights you have the moment that you're arrested is. And so here we go. These are all rights that you have the moment that you're arrested. The first one is your right to a grand jury. A grand jury is a trial before the trial where they decide if there's enough charges to have a trial, right? The example being, I guess, with Breonna Taylor, right? When Breonna Taylor was shot by the cops, they had a grand jury hearing to decide if they could hold the police officers accountable. In that grand jury hearing, instead of giving them some sort of punishment related to involuntary manslaughter because they shot her after serving an incorrect search warrant, instead, the only charge that they gave was wanton endangerment. And that's really only because 2 bullets went through the ceiling of a neighboring apartment. If every single bullet that they shot at Breonna Taylor had gone into her apartment, they wouldn't have even pressed a wanton endangerment charge. However, because 2 bullets went a place that they weren't supposed to, the grand jury determined that they could only charge with wanton endangerment instead of, involuntary manslaughter. They do say that the grand jury wanted to press different charges, but the district attorney only wanted them to be able to press wanton endangerment, but that's another story, right? A trial before trial where we decide if there's enough evidence for an actual trial. Number 2, double jeopardy just means you can't be tried for the same crime twice, right? And so the example is if you murdered someone tomorrow, right? And then they had a whole trial. I don't know, pretend your name's OJ, right? And you murder someone, you have a whole trial, they decide that you aren't guilty of it. Then even if they found video of OJ murdering his wife today, he could not have a trial for murdering his wife because he beat that charge. And so it puts the impetus on the government that if they're going to have a trial, well, then they have to be sure that they have enough evidence. And if you beat the charge, it doesn't matter that they find a video of him murdering his wife. It doesn't matter that he published a book that says, if I murdered my wife, this is how I did it, which he actually did. They can't use that against him in court because he beat the charge the first time, right? If he murdered another person tomorrow, they could have a trial for a new murder, but his wife's, murder is settled, and technically OJ didn't murder his wife. That's all we have to say about that one, right? Eminent domain is not necessarily related to being accused, but it just says this, that if the government is like building a new school and they determine that the best place to build the new school is your land, it sucks, but you're going to have to move off your land and they'll pay you for it, but that's it, right? The government can take any of your land that they need for whatever reason, as long as they can justify it, and they will have to pay you. But it doesn't matter that your whole family's lived there forever. That's eminent domain. You have to move if the government decides to build a interstate where your house used to be. Due process means that a person's rights cannot be taken away without a trial. And so, even if you were a serial killer, even if you were a 9/11 terrorist, everyone has a right to a trial. You shouldn't be able to be thrown in prison without a trial. And so every single person that's in prison should have had a trial. And if someone, for some reason, was not given that right, well, then there you go, right? Due process isn't just about trials, but it's also about, the things leading up to trials, getting a lawyer. But that's going to be more the last one. The fifth part is no self-incrimination. And I'm saying them in this order because of what we're going to talk about in class. And that just means you can't be forced to testify against yourself. We already talked about that during our mock trial project. But the idea here is if the government is saying you did the wrong thing and you always have to say the truth on the stand, no self-incrimination makes it so that the government has to prove it. And they could use your accomplices to prove it against you, right? I tell Mr. Greer I'm going to murder someone. Well, then Mr. Greer can testify, right? But if they pull me on the stand, I never have to testify. And the government can't use the fact that I stayed silent against me in court. And so no self-incrimination just means that, they have to prove that you did anything, not you have to prove that you didn't do anything, right? In France, that's not a thing. And so in a trial in France, if you decided not to talk, the prosecutor would say, and he didn't talk, and that's how we know he's actually guilty. All right, we'll watch that video.
Hi.
Sixth Amendment, easy, fair and speedy trial, right? And so that just means that your trial has to be as fair as possible. How do we ensure a trial is fair? Well, we ensure the jury pool is as diverse as possible. How do we make sure a trial is fair? We make sure that everyone gets a lawyer. How do we make sure a trial is fair? We make sure that that if for some reason your lawyer didn't represent you well, you can appeal it to the next level, right? Like anything that's about fairness. How do we make sure a trial's fair? We kick evidence out that shouldn't have been allowed. How do we make sure a trial's fair? Well, I mean, think about our trial process. Anything that was deemed unfair, well, we couldn't do. So there you go. How do we make sure it's speedy is a different thing. They say speedy trial is the number one right that gets violated, one of the rights that gets violated the most, right? Not because it takes a long time for a trial. If someone broke the law today, pretty much a year from now is when the trial would happen, right? That's not a violation of speedy trial because that's as fast as it can be done. We need to investigate. It just takes a while for these things to go through. But they say that, you know, if you were defending yourself and you wanted a continuance, right? You want your trial to be a later date. Well, that's you giving up your right to a speedy trial. And you're giving that right because, well, you want to, you know, have more evidence. So this right does get violated in that manner. But as long as the trial happens in a, you know, quick manner, eventually it's okay. But the average amount of time for a felony in North Carolina is at least a year. And so like that Hedingham shooter that happened at least a year ago now, I think the trial still hasn't happened. And that's kind of interesting. Cool. 7, super easy. It just means this, and this is with 3 and 7, those are the two easiest ones to understand. It means this. In a civil trial, where one person is suing another, and you're suing another person for more than $20, you have a right to a jury. It's that simple, right? And so the example I always give is Taylor Swift. She was suing someone for $1, and I never really remember the full circumstances around it. But like in that trial, it would be a bench trial. A bench trial is a trial with just a judge making the decision of guilt and innocence. And the reason why, well, it's because of she only sued for $1, and the 7th Amendment says it has to be 20. Back in the day, 20 used to be a lot, right? With inflation, that's like 150-ish or more. But now $20 is nothing. And so pretty much anytime someone sues someone else, you can have a jury if you so want a jury. Number 8, cruel and unusual punishment, super interesting amendment. It just says this, that there can be no cruel and unusual punishment, and then this one, no excessive bail. And then this is not necessarily part of the amendment. I mean, it's just an interpretation that came after time. But what do we mean by cruel and unusual punishment? We just mean, well, we have to think like, is what is happening to the person cruel, right? And so we're going to talk about cases that someone was mentally incapacitated. You know, can you execute that person? Can you give life in prison without parole to a person who is under 18, right? Could you, is it cruel to execute someone, right? The death penalty is totally legal, so the answer must be no. But like, what are the humane methods of execution? Technically yesterday, and it's kind of interesting, the first execution using nitrogen was done in the United States, right? Where they just take oxygen out of the room and they put nitrogen in the room. I don't know, Google it if you find it interesting. But like, they do that because it's less cruel than lethal injection, which apparently makes your veins burn. I don't know. But like, think about like how we execute people. They have to execute people in the least cruel means. Like, you're killing someone, but how do you make it not painful? I don't know. Unusual means that, you know, if hypothetically someone can't pay child support, right? An unusual punishment, even though they can't pay child support, is to ban a person from having more kids, right? Like, that would be an unusual punishment. Even though it definitely seems related to the crime, we would deem that as unusual because, well, we can punish people by like putting them in prison. We can punish them by taking funds out, right? You could take stipends from that person's paycheck, but what you couldn't do is say you can't have any more kids, even if that person isn't like being able to support their kids. That would be an unusual punishment. That would not be cool, right? You couldn't subjugate someone to walk barefoot for a year, right? Even if they stole 100 pairs of sneakers, right? Your punishment is to be barefoot for a year. They would think about it every single day, but that would be an unusual punishment. We have acceptable punishments, and if it's in that range, it's cool. But the moment that you veer from that, that's not cool. The last one is no excessive bail. Bail is what you pay so that you don't have to sit in prison while you wait for your trial. We said a trial takes a year. And so imagine you are a non-guilty person, convicted, accused of breaking the law, right? If you couldn't pay bail, well, then you'd have to sit in prison until your trial. As long as bail is not excessive, well, then anyone should be able to not have to wait in prison. Now, like, there are plenty, people say the bail system's broken, right? People say that, if it's $10,000, like who has $10,000 laying around? It would be a punishment to have some sort of bail price, and technically you get that money back. But if you don't have $10,000 to put up, well, then you're going to have to use a cash bail system service, and then you'll pay the cash bail people 10% of the $10,000 that you owe. They'll put up the other $9,000, but then they're going to keep that $1,000 that they, that you loaned them. And so at the end of the day, the system's kind of broken when they talk about the bail system because of that, right? When you see bail bonds, it's 10% that you have to put up, the other 90% they put up. But the problem is, you will not get that 10% back. And so they say it unfairly affects poor communities by forcing them to lose 10% of the price just because they didn't have the money to put up in the first place. All right, second to last one is Amendment 9. I'm going to talk about this word penumbra. I like to use the projectors when I show it, but penumbra is a word that talks about the difference, the shadowy area behind an image, right? And so when you have a overhead projector, there's the shadow, which are things that the government clearly can't do, right? There is the are things that are not written in the Constitution that we're sure the government can't do. There are things that are written in the Constitution that we're sure that the government can do, right? Like all of the amendments we've talked about. Clearly, you have a right to free speech. Clearly, you have a right to own a gun. Clearly, you have a right to not quarter soldiers. But we say the Ninth Amendment is about the penumbra because it's the area between the light and the darkness. That's how one Supreme Court justice put it, right? And so we have rights that are not written in the Constitution, and you can see 3 examples right now. You can work as many jobs as you want. You can have as many kids as you want. You can spend your money however you want. You can own as much property as you want, right? And if the government passed a law saying you can't own a bunch of property or you can only have 5 kids, we would all argue that's illegal, even though the Constitution doesn't say that that's illegal, right? But that when we say that you have rights, well, then that's included. The reason the Ninth Amendment was created was because they were sure that there were other things that we wanted to make sure that were protected. And it's kind of like the caveat. It's like an asterisk at the end of the other 8. And it's like, okay, in case it's clear, there might be some things that you can do that are not in the Constitution, right? And so the right to abortion was allowed under the Ninth Amendment. Your right to own contraception, which has now been declared not okay, right? Your right to contraception was allowed in the Ninth Amendment, and it still exists, right? And so the Ninth Amendment just focuses on this idea that there are some things that they knew that they wanted us to do that we might not be able to do. Right. The very last amendment is the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment is kind of the catch-all to make sure that states have power. I know all of the other 9 are focused on people because, once again, anti-federalists wanted to focus on people's rights, but they also wanted to focus on states having rights. And so this is them focusing on states having rights. This is where Mr. Miller's from. It's called Escanaba. It's unrelated to all of this, but there you go, Escanaba. Anyways, the 10th Amendment just says this: if a power is not given to the federal government, it's written to be given to the states, right? So the federal government can clearly do everything that it said, but if the government has a power that's not given to the federal government, it's given to the states. So the example is the federal government can make war, right? The states will never be able to do that, right? But the government is supposed to collect taxes, right? But it doesn't say only the federal government can collect taxes, so that's why states can collect taxes. It says the government's supposed to set up schools, right? But it doesn't say the federal government setting up schools, right? That's a thing that the states do. It says maintain roads is a thing that the states are responsible for. And so there are specific things in Article 1, Section 8 that the federal government's responsible for. And then the other things that we all agree are functions of government are things that the states can set up, right? And so, if a state wants to set up a energy grid that only exists in its state, well, that's the state's incentive. And that's what Texas did, right? Texas is responsible for its own energy grid, whereas the rest of the United States, well, we, have an intertwined energy grid that is different, right? What's another weird thing? The state of Florida decides to, not teach critical race theory, right? That is the state's choice on how they're teaching it. And the federal government can't tell the state that they can't do that, right? Every state gets to decide that. And there's a word called laboratories of democracy, which basically means that every state is its own tiny lab and that we test out what is successful and what is not successful. And if something's successful, well, it should come to the rest of the United States. And if not, well, it should stay where it is. Each state is its own laboratory working at the best it can.